Welcome. Welcome to the Penn Humanities Forum. I'm Jim English. I direct the forum. As the director, I have the policing duties, as my colleague just said, to ask you please not to use flash. You may take pictures, but please no flash bulbs. And also, Rebecca Solnit would prefer, and we would prefer, no audio recording this evening. So thanks for that and for coming out tonight. Rebecca Solnit's talk is the first of two major keynote addresses for the conference, an Ecotopian Toolkit for the Anthropocene. The second of these addresses will be tomorrow night at the Rainey Auditorium down the hall. James Henson will speak about environmental science and political activism in the context of his own very important work on climate change. With their attention to artists, scientists, activists, academics, and the lay public, and how they can better share each other's concerns and speak each other's languages, these events also comprise a final installment and culmination of the Humanities Forum's year-long program on translation. The topic director for the program, Bethany Wiggin, associate professor in the German department, is also the organizer, yes, hooray, but I'm going to say a little more about her. Bethany is also the organizer of the Ecotopian Toolkit Conference and the founding director of the Penn program in environmental humanities. So she's doing it all these next several days and has indeed been doing practically all of it all year long. It's been a great pleasure working with her, and I'm enormously grateful to her for all her fantastic ideas and untiring labor. As we close out the year on translation, we also bring to a close the era of the Penn Humanities Forum itself, the Forumocene, I guess. Thanks to a $10 million gift from Dick and Naomi Wolf, when we launch next year's events and activities, we will be the Wolf Humanities Center, a somewhat altered and enlarged enterprise. The forum has existed 18 years. There have been 2 faculty directors, 3 interim directors, 16 different topic directors, working under the auspices and authority of multiple deans, associate deans, provosts, presidents, and heads of funding entities. Throughout, there has been one human constant, ensuring the forum's smooth running and strong reputation, and providing the sound basis for its ever-expanding program of research and public conversations. That constant is Jennifer Conway, Associate Director of the Forum since its founding in 1999. Jennifer retires. Hold on, because I'm going to ask you to applaud a little louder than that in just a second. Jennifer is in the back of the room right now. She retires this June from a long and really amazing career of brilliant and varied service to the university. Believe me when I say I could go on at great length, I would dare say emotional length about Jennifer. This is not the right time or place for that kind of a speech, but I do ask you now to join me in a moment of applause for someone who has done so much for so long, so expertly, and with such grace on behalf of the humanities at Penn and throughout Philadelphia. Jennifer Conway. Joining with the forum and the program in environmental humanities to present tonight's talk, and indeed playing the lead role in making the event possible, has been the Penn Institute of Contemporary Art. The ICA has been a major venue for contemporary art and culture for 50 years more, but never more so than under the leadership of its current director, Amy Sadow. Amy came to ICA after a decade as executive director of visual aids in New York, and she has continued here on our campus to demonstrate her capabilities as a dynamic institution builder and an engaged cultural activist. With her ICA colleagues, Alex Klein, G. Wesley, Kate, several others that I won't name, Amy has arranged to bring Rebecca Solnit to Penn today. She will now introduce Ms. Solnit and get things properly started, so please welcome Amy Siddell.
It's amazing to be here with you tonight. Thank you for coming out. Philadelphia looks really good. So the Institute of Contemporary Art is pleased to co-present this evening with Rebecca Solnit. And while we are not at our museum, obviously we're in the Penn Museum, I do invite you to join us at ICA this next season, opening April 28th, with exhibitions that explore both the ecological and the body, because at ICA we look for artists who can give us alternative views of the future. As a writer, historian, activist, Rebecca Solnit collapses the boundaries between feminism, cultural theory, art criticism, memoir, and political analysis. She explores themes of the imaginative and political potential of landscape and place, of community and human connection, of racial and environmental justice, and of the very nature of uncertainty and hope. She suggests that visual art is a way to learn to read things carefully and to ask questions about meaning, about perception, and about influence. And at The Guardian, at Harper's, and over the span of 20 books, the most recent, which was published just last month, she has earned our respect, if not our love, for her clarity, the way that she invites the reader to join in a process of discovery and of knowledge building. I'm sure that everyone in this room has experienced that feeling when reading Rebecca's work, of being a glorious passenger along for the ride as she makes the most unexpected and brilliant connections, and as she explains data, even really boring and well-known data, through stories, all in prose, so effortless and subtle that it feels like shared thinking. We celebrate her, as she is very proud to be a product of public schools from kindergarten to graduate school, and to be an independent writer since 1988, which is like over 30 years, so much respect for both of those. We who believe that the museum is a space to confront objects and ideas, and that the project of art is to help us see difference and to see differently, we are grateful for her refusal to separate our resistance from our joy. As she has written, what is the purpose of resisting corporate globalization if not to protect the obscure, the ineffable, the unmarketable, the unmanageable, the local, the poetic, and the eccentric? These forms, these practices of art and poetry, of performance and culture, she asserts, are valuable acts of resistance. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Rebecca Solnit.
Wow, there's a lot of you out there. Thank you so much for coming. I decided to repack my toolkit this morning, and the talk is essentially an unpacking of 4 things I think are essential for the tasks that await us. And this is sort of about the tools we already have, not the go out and, here's what you lack. In a sense, maybe. We'll find out. 1, hope and its intersections. This is a conference organized around the wonderful idea of the toolbox. And I want to start with Pandora's box, the one she opened out of curiosity, and out of which everything flew but hope. Maybe hope is enough. Not optimism, which is a confidence about the future that requires nothing of us, like its opposite, pessimism. Because to believe that everything will inevitably be all right isn't really much different than to believe that we're doomed and can do nothing about it. At least when it comes to toolkits. Neither of these require tools or using them. Both of them contain a deadly certainty, a sense since we know what will happen, we don't have to do a damn thing. If you want to do anything, if you want to intervene, you begin with hope, which is a sense of possibility, a knowledge that the future is in some ways, if not entirely unwritten, that you might be able to add an accent mark or write a few syllables or a sentence or two, shed some light on something dark or provide some shade for something glaring. Alone or more likely with your colleagues, whether that's a legal team, or a movement of millions. My kind of hope is an open-minded uncertainty about the future, a clear knowledge that we're heading into terra incognita, always, that the world is full of unforeseeable and unpredictable surprises, and that our tools for venturing forth into it come from the past, from knowing our history. First of all, from knowing that we are in history, in a dynamically changing continuum with enormous forces at work, not in a static or inevitable status quo, a pervasive present. Then knowing that there's a tremendous history of victories over the past couple of centuries, densifying the last half century or so with the rise of movements for the rights of women, of gay, lesbian, and trans people of color, the disabled, and the environment, among other movements. Movements that are profoundly transformative about how we think about ourselves and our places in the world, and in the case of environmentalism, the place itself. It's been a profoundly democratizing, leveling series of movements overall, movements of inclusion and increasingly a shift toward or a return to imagining a world of interconnected system rather than alienated and isolated objects and fragments. That is, the environmental movement was always, at least from Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, about thinking systemically, about interdependence, as a conservation movement, which was mostly about protecting pretty places by separating them out from development and industry, and commerce was not. Though what the systems are understood to be has been a shifting thing. I was lucky enough to be around in the late 80s when the environmental movement had to shift from imagining that most of the pristine and thriving natural spaces around the world were virgin nature, a place in which humanity did not belong and had only recently arrived in, or had not really arrived in at all. So the transformation came as indigenous people spoke up, as non-indigenous people became slightly better at listening to them, as allies rewrote ecologies and histories to include what had been excluded, and really reframed broadly our entire sense of nature, broke down the idea of a nature-culture divide with the idea of culture as separate rather than arising from and contained within nature, and reminded us that lots of people had been living pretty harmoniously with the natural world for millennia, and that was actually maybe more normal, a human condition, than the stuff we were wrestling with, which was, for those of us in the developed world, ourselves. So I was around Rainforest Action Network and other groups in the late 1980s when indigenous rights, the kind this generation met at Standing Rock, came to the fore in the environmental movement, breaking the old binaries, moving us past the 1964 Wilderness Act's definition of wilderness as, quote, a place in which man does not belong, which I've always thought said nothing about women, but whatever. And 1964 was when you could say man to mean all of us, which is something happily you can no longer do. And good evening, womankind. So, and begetting its own kind of intersectionality, which we mostly talk about as two kinds of identity, your race and your gender, maybe, your gender and your orientation, or your class and your ethnicity. But we could, in the city of ideas with 1,000 intersections, used to mean any intersection between any two ideas, disciplines, or fields, or bodies of knowledge, that it's all ultimately a kind of network. A network is in a sort of broad series of nodes of intersection, of crossroads. So I want intersectionality as a way of thinking about sort of all of this connectedness. Hope for me is also built on a foundation of understanding that change is not necessarily simple, straightforward, direct, predictable, or instant results guaranteed or your money back. What you do may matter tremendously. How it matters may be impossible for you to determine beforehand. It may not be something you understand fully in your own lifetime. It may have impacts you never intended in places you'll never go, on people you'll never meet. The notion, one of the ways I see people get unhappy with their activism is expecting we will go out, we will march against this bad thing today. We will, and either we will stop it tomorrow or we will have failed. So I wrote last month, I think it's a mistake to regard the gathering of tribes and activists at Standing Rock, North Dakota, as something we can measure only by whether or not it defeated one pipeline. You could go past that to note that merely delaying completion beyond January 1st cost the investors a fortune, and that the tremendous movement has generated widespread divestment and a lot of scrutiny of hitherto invisible corporations and environmental destruction. And thereby it makes building pipelines look like a riskier, potentially less profitable business. It may stop pipelines we'll never hear of because they'll be stopped before they start. May have already, as Keystone's cancellation in 2015 because of 6 years of amazing work by activists caused a series of cancellations across North America. But Standing Rock was vaster even than these practical things, these petroleum and pipelines. At its height, it was almost certainly the biggest political gathering of Native North Americans ever seen. Said to be the first time all 7 bands of the Lakota had come together since they defeated Custer at Little Bighorn in 1876. One that made an often invisible tribe, the Standing Rock Sioux, visible around the world. What unfolded there seemed as though it might not undo one pipeline, but write a radical new chapter to a history of more than 500 years of colonial brutality, centuries of loss, dehumanization, and dispossession. Thousands of veterans came to defend the encampment and help prevent the pipeline. In one momentous ceremony, many of the former soldiers knelt down to apologize for the crimes of the U.S. Army and ask forgiveness for their long role in suppressing Native Americans. Like the Native American occupation of Alcatraz Island at the end of the 1960s, Standing Rock has been a catalyst for a sense of power, pride, destiny, identity. It's an affirmation of solidarity and interconnection, an education for people who didn't know much about Native rights and wrongs, an affirmation for Native people who often remember history in passionate detail. It's a confirmation of the deep ties between the climate movement and Indigenous rights that has played a huge role in stopping pipelines, particularly in and from Canada. It has inspired and informed young people who may have half a century or more of good work yet to do. It has been a beacon whose meaning stretches beyond one time and place and illuminates many things for us as we go forward. One of the things that's amazing, I spent a few days at Standing Rock. I wish I could have spent a lot more time there. So a lot of Native people have a deep, strong sense of history. They can recite what was contained in the treaties from 150 years ago, how they were dispossessed, who the land used to belong to. They have a long time sense that's so, it's kind of deep past that I think makes a deep future imaginable in a way that those of us stuck in the kind of shallows of pure present don't always have. To know history is to be able to see beyond the present, to remember the past, gives you capacity to look forward as well. It's to see that everything changes, and the most dramatic changes are often unforeseen. I want to go into one part of our history at slightly greater length to explore these questions about consequences. And that's from a recent essay of mine in The Guardian, which goes on to contemplate the Clamshell Alliance. How many of you have heard of the Clamshell Alliance? Wow, about 5% of you. It's affected your lives and everything around you, but it would be great if everyone had heard of them. The Clamshell Alliance was a group that came together in the mid-1970s to try and stop the Seabrook nuclear power plant in New Hampshire. It failed to do that, but braided together a set of values and techniques, built a new toolbox that has been instrumental in nearly every progressive left-wing, radical, countercultural movement in the United States and North America since, including some of the tools included nonviolent direct action and consensus process. These things had existed before, but the way they were brought together, the way they were refined and honed and made effective and integral was something extraordinary and new. You could say they built a huge toolbox out of tools others had made earlier. You can tell a simple story, in other words, in which the Clamshell Alliance set out with one goal and failed to achieve it, shutting down that nuclear power plant. Or you can tell a complex story in which they're impacted by movements before them, all the way back to the Quakers in this country, the origins who gave us the consensus process out of their methodologies, and out of Gandhi and Satyagraha and Ahimsa, the sort of nonviolence and action abroad. And of course, Gandhi was much impacted at his outset by women suffragists in Britain, who he crossed paths with in 1906, speaking of intersections. So, in their wake, as Leslie Kaufman writes in her fantastic new book, Direct Action, activists were able to stop more than 100 nuclear projects or help them get canceled over the next several years. But the toolbox these anti-nuclear activists assembled didn't just help anti-nuclear groups. It became standard for every movement we've seen around AIDS, human rights at home and abroad, anti-war activism, environmental activism, and pretty much every other attempt to attain progressive goals through grassroots means and direct action tactics. The consensus process, which came from the Quakers with some changes, was about having an internal process that reflected the goals of being inclusive, equal, nonviolent, of not having methodologies that favored the confident and promoted charismatic leadership at the expense of other voices, or the tyranny of the majority. It's a process that works towards finding common ground and reaching decisions that reflect the hopes and desires of everyone. It was part of what's been transformative about the activism that didn't come out of the over-mythologized 60s, but the underrepresented 70s and 80s. So the second thing for this toolbox, because I think it's a toolbox for disasters and the ongoing disaster with flare-ups of catastrophe that is climate change, is understanding disaster. And understanding disaster means understanding human nature. A disaster is a rupture in the continuum, akin in many ways to a revolution. It's an arrhythmia, and there's always a question of whether you'll go back to the old rhythm and order or whether something new will be forged. Much of the scramble of elites and the powerful in disaster is not really to save lives, but to save the order that put them at the top, gave them power and wealth. And sometimes they institute an even more onerous order, what Naomi Klein talked about as disaster capitalism. But sometimes things go in the opposite direction with a kind of disaster anti-capitalism. Earthquakes in Mexico City and Nicaragua, for example, contributed to a revolution and massive reform and democratization in those countries. Hurricane Katrina led to some disaster capitalism, but also to some insurrectionary and ecological change for the better, some reform in the extraordinarily corrupt institutions of New Orleans in particular, and possibly to the election of Barack Obama, but that's an elaborate story I unfold in my book about disaster, A Paradise Built in Hell. In the wake of a disaster, ordinary people do extraordinary things. They reach out to each other to improvise rescues and search and rescue teams, to organize community resources and networks, build soup kitchens and shelters and camps. They're generous and resourceful, and often in this work they find a meaning and connection missing from their everyday life. And more than that, a sense of self and community that might have been missing before. And in those two extraordinarily valuable things, a sense of joy. Part of what is remarkable is that people don't seem to do this because of their beliefs. Sometimes they do so despite them. If you'd ask people in the financial services businesses housed in the World Trade Center towers about their values just before 9/11, there would have been a lot of free market, rugged individualism. But in the minutes and hours and days after those two planes struck the towers, no one was pushed or elbowed or shoved or elbowed aside. No every man for himself ethos emerged. No one panicked. No one stampeded or trampled anyone else. Something completely different manifested. So, and that's really extraordinary and was underrepresented. We're told 9/11 was about heroic men in uniform, that we needed to trust the military, the government, and men with weapons, and et cetera, that we were terrorized, although the people in those towers did not panic, were not too terrified to make extraordinarily good decisions. Virtually everyone below where the trains impacted was successfully evacuated, including a paraplegic man who was carried down 67 flights of stairs by his coworkers. And maybe the most extraordinary story I found there was by a guy named John Guilfoyle, who told the Columbia University oral historians that he'd been an athlete in college, and so he was faster than his coworkers. So as that cloud of toxic shards of gas and everything, of glass and everything else the building was made out of came at them, and he and his fellow employees were running away, he said the most extraordinary thing. He said, I slowed down a little bit to keep pace with them. And that's always staggered me, because everything we've ever seen in disaster movies, everything we're told is that it's a sort of every man for himself moment, that we're scared, that we're selfish, that we're concerned only or primarily about ourselves, or that if you're loyal, you'll be maybe loyal to your family or people you're incredibly close to. But here's this athlete with death at his heels, slowing down to keep pace with people he works with, not the most intimate people in his life even. And he doesn't even get what's kind of surprising about saying that. Everything we were told about disaster is untrue, because everything we're told about disaster is what we were told about human nature. We were told that we were selfish, that we were fearful, that men became marauding beasts in disasters. And if you've seen a lot of disaster movies, as I did for research for that book, that women are panicky, hysterical, frightened, paralyzed creatures. And mostly that's, the disaster sociologists say panic is vanishingly rare. It's often misapplied to people behaving incredibly appropriately. Running from death as fast as you can is actually really sound judgment, not... but that'll get called panic by idiotic newsmen watching footage at, the people foraging in a post-disaster landscape where money no longer exists, commerce no longer exists, are often called looters, when they're often deeply altruistic people gathering resources for the most needy among them. And that got wildly misunderstood in Hurricane Katrina and the earthquake in Haiti, with racial overtones, of course, where people were portrayed as thieves who might have been doing what was absolutely necessary for other people to survive in the absence of any other way to do it. So we've been sold a bill of goods about who we are. And I think for any good toolkit, that sense of human nature, that not only do we behave well in disasters, but that we deeply desire what sometimes, when there's not too much oppression, too much racism, too much violence from the state, too much division, what sometimes we discover, which is a sense of community, of possibility, of meaningful work and agency, that produces a kind of joy that tells us not just that we're adequate to facing disasters because we're brave, we're resourceful, we're empathic, but that there's something there that we deeply want, that we don't even talk about. I talk about what we do what we're told most of the time is that what we want is what I call private love. We want our personal private life to flourish, which means sort of sex and romance and partnership and maybe offspring, and a kind of intimate circle and a lot of goods and money and toys and financial security, all the stuff that kind of fits inside the house and private life. But what you discover in disasters, how deeply people want what I call public love, a sense of meaning and purpose and belonging, a sense of community, a sense of agency, of voice, of doing something that matters. And they find that sometimes in disaster. And what was extraordinary for me was that joy in disaster that showed how deeply we want this, that even amidst death and destruction and an utterly uncertain future, people describe often a kind of joy and meaning that shines out so brightly from stories of even of Katrina and 9/11 from the people most impacted. I've heard them myself. Even from the 1906 earthquake in my own town, San Francisco, even from the London Blitz. And you see that in that other sense of self that has been rendered largely invisible and forgotten when you live in a capitalist society is some sense of possibility that I think is also another kind of hope, a hope about who we are and who we could be. Addressing climate change is going to mean coming up with a radically different sense of what constitutes wealth, security, prosperity, well-being. It's going to mean telling different stories, and those stories will begin with who we are and what we want, and getting over the stories that we're selfish people who just want more stuff, that we're isolated people who can only be secure by having as much stuff as possible individually rather than living in a society where maybe there's some bottom line of well-being guaranteed and you don't need to hoard so much individually. So, and this is some of what disasters teach us, is that this is not only who we can be in an emergency, but this is a side of ourselves we don't always see that hasn't been much encouraged, developed, illuminated in the culture we're in, but is nevertheless there. It seems ineradicable. And part of what's amazing about disasters that it's not, people don't suddenly do these extraordinary things because they've studied them, because they've aspired to them. It's like a default setting. When the power goes off, there's a kind of reset, and there's a sense in which the power of the status quo goes off, and literally there's usually blackouts in these major disasters. But there's a kind of social reset where people actually know how to organize and they know how to connect. In the New York City blackout a few years after 9/11, people knew what to do and how to look after each other, and they did. We already know that's in the toolbox. We have it. So joy is not very marketable. You can see the whole business of buying and selling and marketing as benefiting more from lonely, frightened consumers than from flourishing citizens, from people who need stuff than from people who need democracy. I mean, you can't sell walking because we already own it. You can sell cars and vacations. You can sell individual pleasures, but not collective well-being. So where there's always this conflict between what my friendship ward calls the tyranny of the quantifiable, which is I have a lot of money in the bank, versus the unquantifiable, which is I live in a society where no children will go hungry. And I think part of the job of all of us as artists, as storytellers, as educators, as citizens, as participants, is partly to build the language, create visibility for the unquantifiable, and to kind of mount a defense of these things that aren't measurable by economics, don't have monetary value necessarily, that benefit us in ways, all of us in ways that we haven't necessarily been encouraged to take into account, but that matter intensely, and that shifting the sense of what matters, creating another kind of accounting system of who has value to one where everyone has value, of what makes us secure from massive military buildup and the pursuit of individual well-being, to a society that's secure from violence, resilient in the face of disaster, that takes care of everyone. So, and that task has been strengthened in the face of a certain election you may have been thinking about obsessively since November 8th. It was a triumph of an ideology I call the ideology of isolation. I wrote about it last summer in Harper, saying, if you boil the strange soup of contemporary right-wing ideology down to a sort of bouillon cube, if you carve away to the very core of far-right utterances, you find this concept. Things are not connected to other things. People are not connected to other people, and they are better off unconnected. Out of this great disconnect comes all sorts of anti-systemic and anti-systematic thinking. If you take it all the way to its illogical conclusion, facts are freestanding items man can manufacture for use as he sees fit. Or so goes the modern ideology we still call conservative, a sort of loopy libertarianism that inverts some of the milder propositions of the conservatives of an earlier era. Ecological thinking articulates inseparability of all things, the interdependence and interconnectedness which can be a beautiful dream of symbiosis when it's how, say, a particular species of yucca depends on a particular moth to pollinate it, and that moth's larva depends in return on the fruit of that yucca for its first meals. Or a nightmare of how toxic polychlorinated biphenyls found their way to the Arctic, where they concentrated in human breast milk and in carnivores like polar bears atop the food chain. The ideologues of isolation are upset by the solutions to climate change, by the need for limits on production and consumption, for regulation, for cooperation between industry and government, and between nations. More than that, the very idea of climate change is offensive to isolationists because it tells us more powerfully and urgently than anything else ever has that everything is connected, that nothing exists in isolation. What keeps the ideology of isolation going is going to extremes. If you begin by denying social and ecological systems exist, that causes have consequences, that poverty, for example, is created by systematic factors that we can identify rather than by individual failure, that what comes out of your tailpipe reaches the upper atmosphere and contributes to a changing climate. If you begin by denying social and ecological systems, then you end in denying the reality of facts, which are, after all, part of a network of systematic relationships between language, physical reality, and the record, governed by the rules of evidence, truth, grammar, and meaning, and so forth, ideas that we've built up collectively and that universities preserve and promulgate. You deny the relationship ultimately between cause and effect, evidence and conclusions, or rather you imagine both as products on the free market that one can produce and consume according to one's preferences. You deregulate meaning, which has happened hard and fast in the alternative facts universe of the kind of boys' club holed up in the White House like it was a fort and increasingly disassociated from the rest. So with their toolkit, they tear things apart, they destroy and disassociate, hoard and impoverish. It's what that toolkit is for, which is why we need to strengthen a toolkit that is the opposite. Because I think being opposition means not only trying to thwart them, but also embodying profound, being the opposite of lies, being the opposite of cruelty, being the opposite of short-term thinking, being the opposite of greed, is part of the mandate that I think that this catastrophe visited upon us was, calls us to. So, and it's also, part of what's interesting to me is that when Trump was elected, the response made it clear to me that it was a disaster because it was as though a nationwide catastrophe had happened. People were deeply distressed, wept, were sleepless, anxious, preoccupied, saw the myriad pending disasters that might await us, the direct threats to vulnerable communities, the devaluation of many lives, the tax to come on many systems of survival. I heard from friends whose children were too terrified to go to school and stayed in bed weeping that first day after. I now hear of schools and places where a lot of the kids or their parents are undocumented, where enrollment has plummeted because kids are afraid to come to school. I hear of women giving birth at home for fear of ICE coming to the hospitals. It is a disaster. But the response was also that beautiful thing you see in disaster. You saw people come together, first reaching out in the first days to make sure to connect, whether they're seeking reassurance or offering it, to kind of strengthen their social networks, to say to people, I'm here with you, are you with me, are we in this together? This real sense of a kind of civil society re-energizing that was extraordinary. And then it began to become action, which of course surged in extraordinary ways with the single biggest demonstration scene, according to data compiled by my political scientist friend Erica Chenoweth and her collaborator, whose name I can't remember, that between 4 and 5.3 million people participated, not only in big cities like this in Los Angeles, which actually had an even bigger demonstration than Washington, D.C., but in little towns in Alaska and Wyoming and the South, all over the country, and people came together and marched. What was even more extraordinary to me than that was a week later, the demonstrations spontaneously happening in response to the ban on, clearly on Muslims from 7 primarily Muslim nations in the Middle East and Africa. People showed up by the thousands, and did it happen in Philly? I assumed it did, but I'm from the other side of the country. We had an extraordinary demonstration, and part of what was so moving was seeing that absolute sense of solidarity with people who are native born, who know that they will not be targets in any way, and the most vulnerable, really absolutely together. This sense of solidarity that comes, the sense of a civil society that I think is ultimately a sense of a democracy, that democracy is built on a sense of us having something in common and of being together in some deep way that I think requires us to mingle, to live in public space, to feel that what we have in common is more important than our differences, and to work towards a kind of coexistence, to be with and for each other. That was so ferociously palpable at the airports. It was an extraordinary kind of, and it was spontaneous, and people were calling for action, but it wasn't planned for months like the walk, like the women's marches were the week before. And so that's part of the toolbox, I think, is a sense of democracy, a sense of community, and a sense of connection and a sense of power, because when we come together, we are powerful. Civil society has been the great other force to militarism, one that, as Erica Chenoweth in her book on the subject has demonstrated, as George Lakey, your Philadelphia resident who does such great work on nonviolence, is an extraordinarily powerful tool for regime change that has succeeded more effectively than violent uprisings, and can succeed here and has, and so that sense of civil society and that sense of power, that we are in fact very powerful, we can win, is part of what I think belongs in the toolbox. There's a kind of paradox. If Clinton had, or anybody sort of within the mainstream had won, I think that we would have had the same kind of disengaged, detached, divided society that we had before the election, that I think is why the election, with its low voter turnout, like way too many other elections, and so there's a kind of re-engagement, and that's one of my big questions about disaster. Is it possible for us to, if a disaster is like something that shakes us awake, through discipline, through storytelling, through a sense of history, through a sense of power, through a sense of responsibility and commitment, can we stay awake even when the disaster lapses? And a vibrant society is one in which people are awake in this sense of engagement and awareness, and a sense of connection, a sense of understanding of systems, and a sense of commitment. All that is woken up, and it's not to say that Trump is a good thing any more than to say earthquakes and hurricanes and bombings and terrorism are good things. It's to say, how do you arrive at those results without disaster? What can you learn from disasters about who we might be capable of being, and replicate the results without the catastrophe? So put that in your toolbox. And then the next thing for toolboxes is stories, which I've been talking about implicitly, but I want to talk a little bit about more explicitly, because I think a lot of the task that is to make, progressives, the Democrats usually have all the facts on their side. The Republicans have all the compelling stories on their side, and facts aren't enough. And there are incredible people in social and physical sciences who bring us facts. Everyone in the arts and humanities, part of our task is to weave those into stories, to make the stories that science brings as compelling and tangible, accessible, woven into the fabric of everyday life. And the political stories, the stories about what makes a resilient society, about public loves, about civil society powers. The radical poet Muriel Rukeyser said, "The world is not made out of atoms, it is made out of stories." And so part of the job of a great storyteller is both to look at the stories that aren't true or that are destructive, that are poisonous, because people like Ruth Kaiser, and I've come across that kind of framework a lot that suggests stories are inherently wonderful, but there are stories about racial superiority, about the untrustworthiness and dishonesty of women, about the rationality of white men, inherent rationality, I get told regularly, and objectivity, and as early as this morning. And because I made that mistake I make almost every day, I went on social media. And, we need to break stories. We need to break stories about the necessity of fossil fuel and our dependence on it. We need to break stories about so many things that people will tell you are impossible that in fact are quite possible. And we need to have the stories about the impossible coming to pass over and over, whether it's the collapse of the Soviet bloc and the sort of totalitarian sort of pseudo, communism, the triumph of same-sex marriage rights nationally and in a lot of other parts of the world, which was another thing that seemed impossible not long before. We need to be story makers and story breakers, and we need to understand how much it's about telling and compelling stories and inviting stories, and stories that speak to everyone, not just to people who have exactly the same toolkits we do, but who might have different sets of assumptions. We need stories that invite people in, stories that invite people to come together, stories that that convey hope. So and so much of that is around climate and climate change, where things have changed so dramatically and so rapidly in three ways that are all interwoven, that when I go back to something like back to 14 years ago, 2003, it's staggering how different everything was. There's a wonderful book that's a history of coal called Coal, A Human History, written by the former Attorney General of Minnesota, who wanted to deal with some of the climate issues as they started to look into coal, and felt like we needed, write a whole history about its emergence as a major fuel, its problems, etc. It was shocking to me looking at that book, which must have been written a little before it was published in 2003. It's a reminder of how far we've come. In 2003, there is no meaningful, powerful, effective climate movement. There is now, and most of the power has been built only in the last decade, a lot by college students, including the 7 college students who, with Bill McKibben, developed 350.org, starting in 2007, with an organization that's done actions in most countries in the world and has presence on most of the continent, every continent but Antarctica, and so there wasn't much of a climate movement. There was a sense that climate change was this slow-moving thing that was really about our grandchildren, problems for our grandchildren, which was always weird for people like me. I have great nephews and nieces already, but the whole grandchildren framework, and that assumed you were sort of middle-aged and reproductive. But the shocking thing about this book about coal is that it talked about what were the alternative to fossil fuels, and that reminded me that there were not good solutions in 2003. One of the banners in the Great Climate March in 2014 said, in New York City, the one with 400,000 people and sister marches all over the world, said, "We have the solutions." We didn't have them in 2003. There's been an energy revolution that has made it possible, as the great science consortium at Stanford has demonstrated, for nearly every country in the earth to go completely off fossil fuels to renewables. We could do it. The obstacles are not technological. Wind and solar and related technologies have become so extraordinarily effective, have transformed so much in becoming infinitely cheaper, far more widespread, often now in many parts of the world, including here and cheap in the United States, cheaper than fossil fuel. So the only obstacles are political, economic, social, the tremendous lock that the fossil fuel industry has on political power. And that's part of the good news. There's a story to tell there about if we shift from fossil fuel, we break the power that companies like Exxon, which has given us our new Secretary of State, who seems, and yeah, who I think may not fully comprehend that after having worked for Exxon for his whole life, that's no longer who he works for. Or maybe he intends to continue working for Exxon. Certainly the collaborations between Exxon and Vladimir Putin and a lot of Russia's political agenda are about that. Putin sees the future of Russia as being in fossil fuel, and therefore that's was part of his interest in a Trump presidency as a kind of anti-climate change policy regime, a kind of loosening as a kind of backward journey. So that's one. So I think we need to tell a story. So there's hopeful stories about climate change. That's partly we've come so far. When you look at all the stuff Trump wants to roll back, part of what it reminds you is how far forward we've rolled, and we've done extraordinary things. There's a way leftists often tell stories about we need to start a movement today and do good things because we haven't done anything yet. And that's one of the ways leftists, of whom I am like a really annoying dissident member, are really depressing. And I'm here to say that actually we need to scale it up and become more powerful and effective, but it is here. The climate change toolkit is fantastic. It's achieving great things. A lot of brilliant people think the transition to fossil fuel is inevitable. The only question is if we'll destroy as much as possible by burning as much fossil fuel as possible, or destroy as little as possible by keeping it in the ground, and as little as possible, what kind of a transition we're going to make, whether we do it consciously, willingly, and constructively, or kind of fall into it after we've raised the temperature of the planet in ways that will make parts of, that will punish people in the equatorial world and the polar realms, the poor, and the other kinds of vulnerable people most. So we're in this extraordinary moment, and where that's profoundly transformative. It has work for all of us to do. What's really, and I think stopping and looking in the toolkit, seeing what grounds are there for hope, what kinds of stories are we carrying, who are we in disasters, what kinds of stories has the climate movement given us that are actually encouraging, that are actually hopeful, that actually tell us how much we could decentralize power as energy in ways that decentralize power as political force. And this could be a great democratizing movement. So we have all these things, and this is the toolkit that I wanted to unpack for you. And, to remind you, not that you need to go out and get those things, but you may have them already. Together we have them. And with them, extraordinary things are possible, and that we can do together as a sort of recharged civil society, as a disaster community, as people embracing the public loves, as storytellers and breakers of stories, as people overcoming the tyranny of the quantifiable, to describe, represent, praise, valuable, all those subtle, ineffable things that make life worth living, that make it complex, it's poetic, it's beautiful, it's meaningful, it's sensual, it's hopeful, and it's deeply weird and interesting possibilities. So I'm really here to tell you that you have all this stuff already, and you do have nothing to thank me for, because there you are. But thank you, and so I'm here to thank you for listening to all that. So I'm happy to take questions. Do we break up at 6:30 or something like that?
We have microphones here.
So they want you to line up and face the microphones, which you might think is intimidating, but it's not nearly as intimidating having 1,000 of you or something facing me here. So be bold, ask me anything. I'll waffle if it's really inappropriate. Okay, yeah. Or not. Well, this is clear evidence that what I said was perfectly coherent and everyone agrees with it. Clearly.
Thank you so much. That was phenomenally inspiring.
Thank you.
Yeah. A brief question. In terms of artists, creators, storytellers alike who are still finding their vocabulary in terms of assembling a toolkit, what advice do you have from your work in the past and present?
And I'm really interested in one of the things that can be complicated about academic work is that it often encourages you to kind of narrow in, and there's a lot of value to having a deep expertise in something, but I think for this kind of work, there's a kind of breadth requirement, which is understanding what I was trying to say earlier about intersectionalities, the intersection between, you could talk about the intersection between climate and racial justice, climate and gender, and things like that. So I think it's never forgetting also a sense of self as whatever academic pursuits you have, never forgetting that you're also a citizen, and that requires a kind of networked knowledge of how things connect and are related. And so pursuing that as well. And pursuing also, I think, communities that encourage you, that you feel at home with, that you can work with, and kind of building power through who you're connected to, which isn't always who you think it's going to be. And, and there's a lot of bitter infighting activist movement sectors I've spent time in, but there's also a lot of really joyous and supportive and dynamic ones, and a lot of visionary ones. And I know people have found with Standing Rock, with Black Lives Matter, with the Women's March, and a lot of this intersectional feminism, a lot of encouragement into who they are and having power and things like that. So does that partly address it?
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Hello, Laura.
Hello. We were talking earlier today about failure.
Yeah.
And, I think that's, for me, a very interesting thing to meditate on these days, but on many levels, because I think failure sometimes can create great opportunity in a similar way that you were talking about disaster, but clearly, as Bethany brought up earlier today, there's a difference between, levels of failure. And I wonder what you think about that.
I think failure is mistake is such an interesting word. I was raised by an Irish Catholic person. My mother, who thought every mistake was the unforgivable sin, and I finally realized in my 20s how paralyzing that was. And and it's interesting thinking about the scientific method as a series of mistakes, in a sense, or a series of things that may not produce the desired results, sometimes produce unanticipated results. And sometimes it's just a process of eliminating possibilities, which is kind of like dating in your 20s. And so failure is such an interesting, it's such a loaded word because we're supposed to be so afraid of it. And when you're surrounded by punitive people, you're so afraid to acknowledge it. But I think it's also, sometimes it's about just a sign of when it's time to make a turn. Sometimes it's actually a way of finding interesting information. What I eventually realized, I think my mother's vision of life without mistakes was of this kind of very smooth path forward. And that I finally realized that the path forward is always bumpy and winding and twisty, with surprising forks and confrontations and obstacles and occasional bad weather. And that's actually how you move forward. If you don't move into that stuff, you're not moving. So I'm interested in mistakes in that sense. And it's also interesting seeing how do you like seeing something like the climate movement, which has shifted focus as new data comes in, which isn't about it being mistaken before exactly, but is about, reassessing in the face of new data, which is also like dating in your 20s. Most things are like dating in your 20s, I think, actually. But let's not go too deep into that. And, so I actually think that there's a kind of embrace of failure, not in the sense of letting things fall apart or abandoning commitments or doing shoddy work, but of taking risks and going places where you're not sure what the results will be. In a funny way, I think that uncertainty that I think is so much part of hope of not knowing what the future is really tied to it. And so thank you.
In my own family, I'm a climate activist and privileged to be such. In my own family, they don't believe that there's climate change. They don't believe that we're experiencing problems that we're responsible for. And I just wondered, you spoke about disasters bringing people together, and I just wanted to hear what you had to say about when it takes families apart.
Yeah, well, what's interesting, if climate change produced a massive hurricane, your family might be really awesome, or a flood or ice storm or whatever, and your family might be very good at responding. Conservatives are often very good at hands-on response, if not at root cause analysis. But particularly when it comes to things like poverty, climate change, stuff like war, little things like that. And, and I have like a lefter than thou family, so I have a different set of problems. And so I don't necessarily have good tactical advice, but it is interesting because there is a way where a lot of people are giving way and acknowledging, because the data is overwhelming. And part of what's interesting to me about climate denial is how much, 97% of all the scientists in relevant fields, that's a lot of people to disagree with. And the theory that all of those people have somehow, it's kind of like, well, can you show me the corruption process? Nobody's ever kind of unveiled, the George Soros $600 billion bribery scheme or whatever it's supposed to be. But it's hard because then you're arguing about facts, and then it's also kind of like, which is usually kind of a losing game. Is there a way to find a story that encourages them about Iowa has, I forget what it is, 30-something% of the electricity in Iowa comes from wind, and that's because it's the most cost-effective way to do it. Is it hey, wind power is this awesome thing where farmers make money and it works really well and it decentralizes us from, it's I don't know. Good luck. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know if I can phrase my question very well, but I'll give it a shot. There's a viewpoint that there's a technological solution. We can geo-engineer ourselves out of our crisis. So if people agree that there is a crisis, they say, well, we can just have clean coal or carbon capture, something like that. I realize there's incredible technology like LED lighting. So it is possible to use technology to help fix problems. But there's some way of cautioning people somehow to say that going down the path we've been on, although it seemed to be okay in the past, may not work in the future and indeed may speed up the harmful effects.
I'm not super equipped to talk about technology, to assess technologies, but I think technologies that don't yet exist or haven't proven to be effective are really a dangerous thing to place your bets on when we know that wind and solar work. But what is interesting with carbon capture, there was a great piece by Chris Mooney, the Washington Post's climate correspondent, earlier this week about a more effective project happening somewhere in the Midwest with growing corn to produce ethanol and then pumping it deep underground, but there's actually plants are, almost every plant is a carbon capture system. And what's interesting is looking at something that's not, because there's often this desire to have the big fix, and that feels like it's a particular kind of mindset. and which is part of, and that a lot of times that the ecological solution is a lot of different kinds of, an ecology of small fixes. That versions of farming, of protecting forests and rainforests, of creating a healthy prairie, are forms of carbon capture that I think are super interesting. We're starting to talk about, like, can agriculture be seen as, can we understand the carbon capture aspect of agriculture and see farmers as not only producing food that comes out of the ground, but putting carbon into the ground? So I think there's exciting room to explore, but it's also kind of like, can we look at the subtle, small solutions and prize the carbon capture that's being done, all over the surface of the earth by plants and by the ocean, and regard and protect those systems as, super sophisticated carbon capture systems we already have. It's something I'm interested in, and so thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your inspiring message. It's sort of a question related to the question right before me, which was, do you connect with conservatives and Republicans? And if you do, or you think we should, how do we do it?
I am like the worst person in the entire world to ask that, because like San Francisco here, like I live in a city that's 13% Republican, but nobody has ever actually seen them. We think some of them are poor immigrants and the rest of them are really wealthy people. And, so I have less, and occasionally I do run into them, and some of them are really delightful people, but I'm actually, I actually have enormous admiration and respect for people who are negotiating in their own families and their communities across really big divides. And one of the things that's really formative for me is that a lot of people take refuge in the left from the mainstream or conservative culture, and I'm in some ways a refugee from the left because that's what I grew up in. So I'm often like critical of the left and interested in kind of deconstructing its stories and seeing what's valuable and what's not so helpful there. But so I can be helpful with the craziness of the left. And particularly the sort of the part that's perfect, which is the enemy of the good, and but I'm not that useful with the right. And it's also interesting. And this phrase that I'm going to write an essay about any moment now, preaching to the choir, is something I want to take apart, because it's often said like we need to convert. Like I used to hear statistics on how many people were climate deniers, and it's like, we don't need to get everyone who's a climate denier on board. We need to get everyone who believes climate change is real to take action. The choir comes to church because it likes to sing and it wants to hear a sermon. The people who are already inclined that way are a big constituency. Something else that got announced this week is this new consortium of groups, from Black Lives Matter to climate groups and other human rights groups, called The Majority, that's just about the fact that there are a lot of common values a lot of us share, and that is the majority of people in this country, whether it's climate or reproductive rights or rights for queer people or something. But we've been very, we've kind of let a minority dominate the conversation. And so I think, if you live among conservatives, you have to find a way to talk to them. And there are some very fun stories about people, whether it's, what's that crazy church in Wichita called? About the granddaughter there, through Twitter, eventually realizing that she could escape this crazy cult and not stop hating people. And there was a white supremacist kid who, through his college, and some Jewish kids who invited him to Seder him, got him to kind of stop being a white supremacist. And, I think outreach is incredibly important, but I also think what I often heard a few years ago in the climate movement is that we had to convince everyone who didn't yet believe in climate change, but they are a minority. We have a majority. We just need to get them to do stuff. So, which side, yeah.
Hi. As I was listening to you talk, you would mention the Quakers, and you talked about ahimsa and nonviolence. And I'm curious about you know, as I was listening, I was thinking also your stories about disaster and people really showing their goodness, essentially, like the goodness in people that comes out. And because I'm a fairly spiritual person, I'm interested in yoga, Buddhism, Quakerism, all those kinds of things, and sort of studied those. I'm curious about your work and how it intersects with questions of faith. Not organized religion necessarily, but just questions of faith. Because I feel like people who are sort of faithful, right, who like the Quakers might think there's goodness in everyone. It kind of ties a little bit into some of what you were discussing about what you see emerging when people are in these disastrous situations.
Thank you. That's a really good question. My friend Jaime Cortez said, and it became part of my book, Hope in the Dark, that beyond hope, which is the belief that hoping for some positive result, you know, and I've almost backed off from the word hope to just see it as a kind of uncertainty principle. But he said beyond that is faith, and you do see people take action. The early abolitionists, Cesar Chavez, etc., where it's impossible for them to be confident that there will be results and do it anyway. So there's a kind of sense that you get often from religious communities of acting on principle, but I want to balance there, because sometimes you see people doing things just because it's a principled thing to do, and I want a kind of pragmatism of like, but this might actually produce results, you know, because sometimes it gets so principled that, and there's a sense of purity there of like, we don't care about results, and it's like, well, if you want to save lives, let's do something that will save lives. And but I also think, you know, a lot of religious communities do a lot of the work in this culture, and whether it's, you know, taking care of homeless and impoverished people, running soup kitchens and other, you know, and one of the joys of spending a lot of time in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina was seeing everyone from anarchists to Mennonites rebuilding the city. And a lot of Protestant, Catholic, Mennonite, other faith groups came through. I know it's interesting. The atheists who attack religion often think that religion is just a set of unprovable supernatural beliefs, but it's often social organization more than anything else. And you see, in Buddhism, you talk about the Buddha, which is that guy, that teacher guy, the Dharma, which is the teachings, and the Sangha, which is the community, the triple treasure. And the community is considered to be as valuable. And for a lot of people, that's a religious community. And I think where a set of values are inherent. And, you know, so I think that is, you know, it's not for everyone. You can't have it as the movement. But it's been disturbing for me seeing how many left-wing people are super anti-religion, because like the Black church has been a core part of African-American human rights organizing and long before the civil rights movement. And a lot of others, you know, and a lot of other groups like the Quakers, who've done brilliant and gorgeous anti-war work for a really long time. You know, so I think of it as just part of the kind of patchwork quilt or constellation of people with strong commitments and beliefs doing things out there, and something that's has a lot to give some people, but not everyone. And, you know, and of course, partly because it coexists with people, you know, really destructive religious organization that's caused a lot of trauma and done a lot of damage, and I'm sure there's plenty of those stories in this room too. So, thank you.
Hi, sorry. I just have a quick question about your writing style that I really enjoy. One of your aspects that I love is how you intertwine your personal narratives with empirical data and philosophical theories and other people's stories. And I was just wondering how or why you came to include your own personal narratives, as that's something that I struggle with as a writer.
And there's two pieces of that. One is that I came of age as a writer in the 1980s, and there was this whole postmodern idea that there's no such thing as objectivity, no neutral position, and that you should identify the position from which you speak, which I think is saying I'm speaking from like like white San Francisco lady, not speaking for everyone. But it's also, I think it can be more honest, and there's often a kind of vivid immediacy of experience that I wanted to recount. But the bigger answer is that the Nevada nuclear test site taught me to write. I started going there as an anti-nuclear activist, an anti-nuclear weapons activist in the 1980s. And I was writing in 3 different styles then. I'd been trained as a journalist. I was working as an art critic, and a kind of investigative journalism, and which was sort of objective, neutral, and then there's the kind of authoritative voice of criticism often. And then I was writing much more personal lyrical essays, and it was like 3 different roads going forward. And the test site was so overwhelming and compelling and complex an experience. And there's the history of the Western Shoshone and the Paiute, whose land it was on, and the history of the making of the atom bomb, the history of civil disobedience, at least as far back as Henry David Thoreau, and all the different groups who came there, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors to nuclear physicists and atomic veterans, and sort of Wiccan lesbian feminists of the 1980s, and everybody. I was and Mormon downwinders and Quakers, and and there's this extraordinarily compelling desert landscape, and there were these 1,000 nuclear bombs exploded in this one place, while most people thought nuclear war was a bad idea that might happen someday. And I just realized, from being in that place and wanting to describe and write about it, that those 3 different styles belong together, and that there was a digressive, meandering way that was really very natural. It's the way we talk. You tell you meet your best friend, you talk about politics, then you talk about your mom, and then you talk about where you're going on vacation, then you talk about your dissertation. Like, we actually think and talk that way. Our minds are able to make these lateral shifts and connections, and it is the kind of meandering byways by which we really understand things. But we're often told that we have to build kind of information, straight roads, even superhighways, to convey information and keep everything off it that's not speeding along. But the short version is the Nevada test site taught me to write, and it's one of the unanticipatable rewards of going there as an activist, and so many things came out of it as well. I spent a lot of time with the Western Shoshone Defense Project, which changed my life, kind of, fell in love with the desert and other things. But the test site taught me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for speaking today, and everything that you said about making stories and breaking stories and creating community and breaking down isolation was very beautiful. But when I think about building community and reaching people, even if they're on the other end of the political spectrum as you, or if they're your best friend or your parent or somebody in your family, like, so much of that work is really about sharing experience and understanding your own experience and another person's experience, which can be really tricky, particularly because we all tell ourselves stories about ourselves and about who we are. But I wonder how we can create a unified movement, and how we can build empathy with each other if some of the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves are in fact wrong. There's an element of truth, and it's not just subjective experience. How do you navigate that?
What kind of stories are you thinking about?
I'm thinking about when you try to build community with another person, and there's already trust built there, and you two love each other. This is a friend, parent, a partner, anybody. But if there's a level of, denial, or of different values, or of, defining success and well-being in different ways, how do you sort of address the fact that, in fact, some of their stories are objectively false, and that who we are is not just subjective experience, but there's also this added element?
And it feels like sometimes family is inevitable. You don't get to choose them, and maybe the one you make, not the one you're born into. But there's partly a pick your battles business of there's stuff it's okay to disagree about, and to disagree about somewhat, and then there's stuff where I'll think a lot of building a community and finding your community is finding the people where who respect you, and respecting you is respecting your stories and your capacity to determine what's real and true and valuable. So it's and I think, that there are, and part of what's been interesting about the post-election era is it does feel like people recognize that there are these core values that are broad and deep beyond our differences, more so than I've felt before, and that people are willing to set some stuff aside, although men still explain things to me. And, and it's been super interesting. I posted something by an amazing writer named Gabriel Valdez about people of color supporting Hillary Clinton, not to get too into and specifically, and it was really interesting getting the same stories about how, like, people should have just gotten on board the Bernie wagon because, and these guys who didn't know that they didn't actually have a corner on true and objective reality, telling that story of, like, well, people of, and basically white guys saying things like, well, if people of color just didn't understand yet, and it's kind of like, hello, colonialism, hello, patriarchy. Now, like, I already heard from you, thank you. But, and but I think it's a constant negotiation, and I don't always agree with myself, and I've changed my mind a lot. So there's also this interesting thing of, like, but I think it's constantly a question you have to ask, what values and beliefs do we have to have in common to work together? And working together on something like a mass mobilization is different than working together on, like, having a family or building a home together, and a lot of room in between. And so, I don't have a really clear answer about that, but it's one of the things I think this country, in its diversity of beliefs and ethnicities and origins and stories, does challenge us in ways that people, there are still people with relatively homogenous experiences, and it feels like part of what the conservatives are at this moment. There's people who still identify with at least a fantasy of a homogenous America that never exactly existed, but where they don't feel like they should have to do that bridging and broadening and make America 1958 again. But anyway, I don't have a great answer. I just have a lot of disassembled thoughts. But
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Oh my God.
Oh,
Yes.
goodness.
One last.
Well, since I'm
And
standing,
snappy answer.
since I'm standing here, I want to add to this the answer to say that in terms of the stories that we tell ourselves, I think we have a lot of learning to do about the impact of trauma on those stories, and in terms of connecting with people. So I just want to throw that out. And also in terms of my question, part of this moment's disaster of this presidential regime is that it feels like, and it is about everything. It's on every front, and while we can make those connections in a broad way and theoretically and in our movements, it is about everything every day in terms of the impact of people on the ground. And I'm just wondering, from an organizing perspective, from a strategy perspective, movement building, or even just on an everyday basis, how do you approach that?
It's funny, I was thinking of George Bush saying, I'm a uniter, not a divider, which in a weird way is true of Trump. But I feel like what we don't have is a kind of unified field theory about how are reproductive rights connected to racial justice, to environmental justice, to climate change, to economic equality, to, how do you articulate? And I think that there are some values about sort of distributed value and non-hierarchicalness and inclusion and nonviolence, et cetera. But I feel like we don't yet have the unified field theory that articulates how it all fits together, and it would be really great if someone could articulate it. And there will have been people, Arundhati Roy did it really well. Early in the millennium, there were people in the civil rights movement who were able to articulate it for a moment. But I feel like we understand it instinctively, but we don't you know, I think we want it kind of like clear as day and, you know, and written down or mapped out or charted in some ways. And I think it's something to work on, like how, and an old woman at Occupy Wall Street said, we're fighting for a world in which everyone has value, and I think that's part of it. And you could fold climate in by looking at who are the climate vulnerable now, but do people who will be alive in 100 years, just, you know, my great niece and great nephew, who, if they have a natural lifespan, may well see the 22nd century, have value, then does that include not destroying the world before they, you know, get through adolescence? So I think that the materials are there, but we have work to do. And with that, I have a bunch of books outside. I'm delighted to sign them, and thank you everyone so much. And thank you.